was Kim Jong-un most afraid of? The US military or the Korean people in the north? And it is the Korean people that he fears the most. And so when faced with internal threats, the regime has always externalized the threat, and they built up this threat from South Korea, from the US, in order to justify the suffering and sacrifice of the Korean people.
Greetings. I'm Rob Burrell. I'm a senior research fellow at the Global and National Security Institute. We also have several University of South Florida students engaged on this call. Today, we have the opportunity to interview retired Special Forces Colonel, national security expert, and active scholar, David Maxwell. Dave has been working U.S. national security in the Indo-Pacific for many decades, and particularly scholarship on the Korean Peninsula. Dave, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rob. Great to be here.
Awesome. So, Dave, you currently work as the Vice President of the Center for Asia Pacific Strategy, and you're also a senior fellow at the Global Peace Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do for those two organizations?
Yeah, so the Center for Asia Pacific Strategy, or CAPS as we call it, is a new think tank founded by a young woman from Korea, Hyun Kim, who worked for four commanders of the UNC, CFC, and USFK as a international affairs advisor. She also worked at the Blue House and at the in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but with the UNC and the Combined Forces Command. And so she started this think tank, which really focuses on alliances in the Asia Pacific region. And we still like to call it the Asia Pacific, even though Indo-Pacific is what the U.S. has adopted. But we really believe in the importance of alliances. And so we look at security issues across the spectrum, which also, other than, in addition to military security, economic security, human security, and the alliances throughout the region. But also we look at connectivity with Europe, and the other continents, particularly NATO, and of course Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand are part of the IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4 part of NATO. And so we really think that all of these alliances are really important to our national security. And so that's really what we focus on. At the Global Peace Foundation, I'm a fellow there, and I work on one issue, which is the pursuit of a free and unified Korea. They allow me to do research and and participate in conferences that focuses on the pursuit of a free and unified Korea. And of course, I'd like to talk more about that as well. In addition, I'm also the now editor at large of the Small Wars Journal. We just relaunched Small Wars Journal for everyone 2.0. The late Dave DeLagey passed away in 2020, and we kept the lights on for the last couple of years, but now Arizona State University has taken over Small Wars Journal, and we're really taking it up to the next level there with the university's support. So happy to talk about any of those issues.
Well, that's fantastic. You've done great work with the Small Wars Journal, and it's been very foundational, I think, for a lot of practitioners in a way to kind of get their ideas out there. So that's great. Thanks for that. Dave, not all of our listeners, unfortunately, are familiar with Korean history like you are. So to start out, can you cover a bit about the current situation on the peninsula and how it's developed, particularly after World War II?
Sure. Of course, our history goes back well before World War II. And in just 1867, the USS General Sherman steamed into the Taedong River in Pyongyang, was burned, and that was our first engagement with Korea. In 1905, brokering the end of the Russo-Japanese War was the Taft-Katsura Agreement that ceded the influence of Korea to Japan, while the Philippines was ceded to the United States. And that really paved the way for the Japanese occupation, which of course ended in 1945. Two colonels at the State Department, Charles Bonesteel and Dean Rusk, saw the coming wave of communism. And although we had no troops in Korea, they really executed a great deception operation and convinced the Soviet Union to take the surrender of the Japanese north of the 38th parallel, while we would take it south of the 38th parallel. That prevented the entire communist domination of the peninsula, and it was necessary because we did not have forces in the area to do that. And so their quick work was able to save the southern half of the peninsula from communism, although it divided the peninsula, which of course remains divided to this day. And in 1950, Kim Il Sung tried to solve the Korea question, and which is the unnatural division of the peninsula, and he attacked. We came to South Korea's aid. The only time the United Nations has ever authorized a major large-scale combat operation, established the United Nations Command. Of course, the Chinese People's Volunteers intervened when we got too close to China, and it ended in 1953 with the armistice, which that armistice is only a temporary cessation of hostilities. In reality, we're still at a state of war between the North and South. The United States did not declare war. We entered on the UN mandate. The United Nations Command exists today to maintain the armistice between North and South. And one key point about the armistice in 1953 is that paragraph 60 called on the political leaders to solve the Korea question, again, which is the unnatural division of the peninsula. And in fact, it specified within 90 days, the political leaders should come together to solve the Korea question, because the military leaders recognized that there was not a military solution. Of course, that did not happen. A year later, there were at the Geneva talks, which everybody remembers, those talks for what happened in Vietnam, but there were also talks about the unification of Korea, which ended in no decision. But the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 811, which called on the world to support a free and unified Korea, a democratic and free Korea. And there have been many resolutions ever since then. And so I just want to set that up that, we've had a war, we've divided the peninsula, had a war, but political leaders have recognized the importance of unification, even though typically we have dismissed the idea of unification really ever since. So that's, and then moving to today, of course, what is really key is that we have successfully deterred an attack and deterred the use of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. Deterrence has been successful, but it has also breeded complacency in the fact that because North Korea has not resumed hostilities and attacked the South, many people have become complacent. That said, North Korea, of course, has developed nuclear weapons, and while they say that they are for defense and deterrence, it is clear that they are using them to support their political warfare and their blackmail diplomacy strategies, as well as ultimately to be used if they choose to reattack, to be used as part of their campaign plan to dominate the Korean Peninsula. So these nuclear weapons are really the focal point of everything. And really have dominated our thinking really since 1994, when the agreed framework was agreed upon, and which North Korea subsequently cheated and broke. And all negotiations since then have resulted in failure on the part of the Kim family regime in the North. Their deliberate decisions to cheat and to violate and abrogate all agreements. And so today we're at a point, and this is really an inflection point. And in the last year, Kim Jong-un has decided to declare South Korea as the main enemy, and he has removed the objective of peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. Both Koreas over the years have said that they would like to have one country, two systems, and then have a gradual unification. Kim Jong-un has taken away the hope of the Korean people in the North that there could be peaceful unification, because they believe that is really the path to their salvation after the 7 decades of suffering that they have been going through. But he's taken that away. And the reason he's taken that away is because Kim Jong-un feels threatened internally. He's under some tremendous stress, which started during the COVID period. He cracked down on the population with horrendous population and resources control measures, and that has really led to low levels of potential resistance, and he's deathly afraid. In fact, Dr. Jung Pak, who used to be the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific, she would always ask, who is Kim Jong-un most afraid of? The U.S. military or the Korean people in the north? And it is the Korean people that he fears the most. And so when faced with internal threats, the regime has always externalized the threat, and they built up this threat from South Korea, from the U.S., in order to justify the suffering and sacrifice of the Korean people. Now, with these announcements of making South Korea the main enemy, they have cut transportation lines between North and South, and today they are building walls on the north side of the DMZ, ostensibly to prevent invasion from the South. And so this is really their propaganda effort to justify the suffering and sacrifice of the Korean people. Now, conversely, South Korea has also made a radical change. And on August 15th, which is, of course, Liberation Day for Korea, ended World War II and liberated Korea from Japan, President Yoon announced the 815 Unification Doctrine. And this is doctrine for the first time recognizes that there needs to be a free and unified Korea that does not come together through some kind of confederal system. The goal is peaceful unification, but the South plans to use human rights and information and in an overt way to pursue a free and unified Korea. And so this is the first substantive plan made by Korea that actually pursues unification. Lastly, I'll just say that in August of 2023, the first trilateral summit of South Korea, Japan, and the United States resulted in the spirit of Camp David and the principles of Camp David, in which all three leaders from Korea, Japan, and the United States declared that the objective is a free and unified Korea. So you have political leaders that support a free and unified Korea, South Korea moving forward with a doctrine, and then at the security consultative meetings and the 2+2 meetings that just took place at the end of October, we now have the Department and Ministry of Defense and the State Department, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, also saying that a free and unified Korea is the objective. This really changes the calculus because for the first time, there is a political end state that the alliance and the both bilateral alliances are seeking to achieve. I'll stop there with that.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Well, no, that was really detailed. So, you mentioned how the U.S. and South Korea and Japan have all kind of coalesced on a strategy of sorts to unify the peninsula, but the rest of, including us, every country in the world has recognized DPRK, North Korea, as its own separate entity. So how do some of the other big players recognize or see the situation on the peninsula, like China and Russia?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, now we see that North Korea and Russia just both have approved their treaty, their alliance, their mutual defense treaty. And of course, we see the North Korean People's Army deploying forces, 10, 12,000, perhaps a number of them North Korean special forces, to support Putin's war in Ukraine. And so obviously, Putin does not support a unified Korea that is not under the rule of Kim Jong-un. And so in China, of course, the longest treaty ally of North Korea, they have what we call the three no's. They want no war on the peninsula, no regional instability, regime collapse, and no nuclear weapons. So they're a pretty good baseball team. They're batting 600. 2 out of 3 aren't bad. But as I've looked at and worked on track two with South Korea, China, and the U.S. What I've come to learn about China is, of course, they want to maintain the status quo, and they want to maintain the status quo for as long as possible. North Korea is a buffer state. They don't want to absorb North Korea. They don't want to be responsible for it. But they also realize that North Korea is not going to be sustainable forever, and something's going to happen. And so I believe what I see from Chinese actions, they are preparing for unification. They are preparing for a unification that will be under South Korea. However, what they are doing right now is they're taking out mineral rights leases in North Korea, 50 years long, 100 years long, because their objective in the long run is to, of course, dominate Northeast Asia politically and economically, but not militarily. They don't want to occupy Korea. And they are happy with South Korea having to accept the burden of unification. But really, China's real objective is when unification happens, they believe that they can drive U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula. That is really their main objective. They can live with a unified Korea, but they want to drive U.S. forces off the peninsula. And I think we see them preparing for that. And that is really their objective. Of course, the sad irony about that is if there is unification in any form, peaceful or after war, it could be that the American people are the ones who demand U.S. forces to come home, and so that could happen because of our own political situation, and then China will get what it wants, and of course, just to put a finer point on it, they're taking out those mineral rights leases because they still want to have access to the Korean Peninsula. And they will use the South Korean Constitution against it because South Korea claims sovereignty over all of the peninsula and all of the people. And so China is likely to argue that the agreements they have made with Koreans, even though they were Koreans in the north, should be recognized by a unified Korean government. And so that is one of the elements that they will use to assert their influence and really domination politically and economically over the entire Korean Peninsula.
That's really interesting. It seems that China's kind of hedging their bets there on the peninsula. So I hadn't heard that. That's very informative. I wanted to get to the national security strategy because our 2022 national security strategy really doesn't discuss North Korea very much. It's only mentioned a few times. And when it's mentioned, it's only about the nuclear issue. You had just got into this a little bit about the other threats that Kim Jong-un poses to the region. So can you talk a little bit about human rights abuses and criminal activities and what else you might see coming from the current regime there?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, before we get into the specifics, I think it's important to see how things are evolving among our adversaries. We start talking about a Cold War 2.0. We start talking about an axis of dictators, axis of totalitarians. I like Christopher Ford's construct he used in an article this summer, the Dark Quad. So you have China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Now, North Korea is always last, always left out. But what is fascinating about North Korea, it is connected to all those countries. And so it is conducting illicit activities around the world, from counterfeiting $100 bills. That's why we've had to change our $100 bills, to drug trafficking, methamphetamines, to counterfeiting cigarettes, counterfeiting medications, money laundering, and of course, there's cyber attacks around the world. Of course, primarily on South Korea, but on the United States, and very sophisticated cyber attacks. And of course, they're learning from the Chinese, from the Russians, and developing sophisticated cyber attacks. They have overseas slave labor around the world. They're making hard currency, constructing, Olympic and World Cup stadiums in the Middle East using that slave labor, and they're proliferating weapons. A whole myriad of weapons, from artillery and small arms to training in conflict areas in the Middle East, in Africa, and of course the tunnels that we see in Gaza and in Lebanon have been built with the advice and assistance of North Korean technicians. And of course, the missile proliferation, collaboration with Iran, and of course, the Scuds launched by the Houthis, all emanate from North Korea, originally from Russia. North Korea repurposes them, rebuilds them, re-engineers them, and provides them to Iran. Iran does the same thing with theirs, and they pass that through to the Houthis. So North Korea is connected to all of these, and of course now they're providing, some reports that as many as 8 million 152 millimeter artillery shells,
Right.
And 122 to Russia to support Putin's war. And so they are really engaged in malign activities around the world and connected to everything. And so we should not discount and we should not think of North Korea as confined to this little peninsula in Northeast Asia. It has global connections, and it is trying to make hard currency for the regime, to evade sanctions that have been placed on it, and so it collaborates, colludes with the other three countries that are members of, I think, aptly called the Dark Quad.
Wow, that's great, Dave. It sounds like a very menacing threat. I appreciate you painting that picture. You've published quite a bit about Korea, particularly of late, and you've conducted several interviews in the Korean press. One of the things that you've argued recently is that U.S. strategy has failed. So can you explain why you think that?
Well, North Korea still has nuclear weapons. Our strategy has been really focused on denuclearization, particularly since 1992, 1993, and then the first agreed framework in 1994. And of course, as you well know, we removed all of our nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula in 1992. And so there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea, no U.S. nuclear weapons in South Korea, no South Korean nuclear weapons either. But we have failed since 1994 to prevent the denuclearization or the nuclear development of nuclear weapons by North Korea, as well as they have also developed an intercontinental ballistic missile capability, which they just tested at altitude, not at distance, but which the open source assessments are that it can reach anywhere in the United States. So North Korea is not only a threat to South Korea, a threat to the region, it is a direct threat to the United States. Now, that said, there are those who say because North Korea is a threat to the United States, that we should not trade Seattle for Seoul. And of course, we are in Korea not just to defend South Korea. We are in Korea really to serve U.S. national interests. And the number one national interest in Northeast Asia is to prevent war. And so our presence on the Korean Peninsula is designed to deter war. When Hwang Jung-yap, the highest-ranking defector, defected in 1997, we asked him why North Korea has spent all their money on the fourth largest army in the world and yet has never reattacked South Korea. And he said that the reason is they know they cannot defeat South Korea as long as they have U.S. support. And he also said that they know that if they attack South Korea, the U.S. will use nuclear weapons against the North. This explains why North Korea has been pursuing nuclear weapons since the 1950s. That it has been a long program. They sent 250 scientists and technicians to Moscow in the 1950s, and in 1963 they returned, established their first experimental nuclear reactor from the Soviet Union, and they have been trying to develop nuclear weapons ever since. And they believe that they not only need nuclear weapons to deter us, but also nuclear weapons play into their political warfare and blackmail diplomacy strategies to be able to coerce South Korea and the United States. And so this is why they have been such a threat. Now, trading Seoul for Seattle for Seoul plays into Kim Jong-un's political warfare strategy because it causes the American people to think that we should not help defend South Korea and we should not deter war. And by doing that, Kim Jong-un's political warfare strategy is being successful because that is what puts cracks in the alliance. And of course, his major goal is to break the alliance, drive U.S. troops off the peninsula so he can be in a position to dominate the entire peninsula. Yes, he has sworn off peaceful unification, but he has not sworn off what is outlined in their constitution as completing the revolution, ridding the peninsula of foreign influence, and dominating the peninsula under the rule of the guerrilla dynasty and gulag state. And let me just say, I use that terminology, guerrilla dynasty and gulag state, for two reasons. Number one is the legitimacy of the Kim family regime is based on the myth of anti-Japanese partisan warfare that Kim Il Sung claimed to be the great guerrilla leader who liberated North Korea. And the Gulag state really represents that North Korea is a prison state. And the human rights abuses that are taking place in the North are just horrendous. And the 2014 United Nations Commission of Inquiry did the research, did the interviews, and they have assessed that the human rights atrocities and the crimes against humanity being committed in North Korea are on a scale that we have not seen since World War II. 25 million people are imprisoned in the North, and they live in a prison society. Everything is controlled with terrible, terrible rules, such as the rule of threes, which quite simply is if you demonstrate disloyalty to the regime, you, your parents, your family, and your children will all go to the gulag. The rule of threes, 3 generations punishment take place. That's just one of the terrible human rights abuses that take place in the North. So I'll stop there.
Wow. Yeah, that's terrible. So, if our strategy hasn't been completely successful, we have a new presidential administration and an opportunity here to maybe, and I know you're avidly at work to try to influence that. So, what advice would you give to a new administration for a new U.S. strategy on the peninsula?
Number one is we have to deal with North Korea with a thorough understanding of the nature, the objectives, and the strategy of the regime. As I've said, blackmail diplomacy, political warfare, and domination of the peninsula by breaking the alliance. That's really what North Korea is all about, and we must look at it through that lens. The political warfare strategy is about subverting South Korea and driving a wedge in the alliance. The blackmail diplomacy is about using increased tensions, threats, and provocations to gain political and economic concessions. The development of advanced military capabilities supports the political warfare and blackmail diplomacy strategies, while at the same time developing the capabilities that can be used to attack South Korea when Kim Jong-un thinks the conditions are right. That said, Kim Jong-un has faced tremendous internal stress, and so there is the possibility of internal instability that could result in regime collapse. And let me just define regime collapse for you. The regime will collapse when the Korean Workers' Party can no longer govern the Northern Territory from Pyongyang. They lose central governing effectiveness, combined with the condition of the loss of coherency and support of the North Korean People's Army. And so the loss of central governing effectiveness by the party and the loss of coherency and support of the military will lead to regime collapse. The danger is those conditions could lead Kim Jong-un to make a rash decision from our perspective, but perhaps a logical decision from his perspective, to go to war, to execute his campaign plan, to dominate the peninsula as his only path to survival. Now, that sounds far-fetched to us because he will not win a war, but from his perspective, that may be his only option. And so people should not necessarily be wishing for a regime collapse, because the conditions of collapse could lead to war. And even if it doesn't lead to a direct attack, inside North Korea, there will be tremendous conflict taking place that as a competition for resources takes place among the military. So the first thing the administration must do is have a clear understanding of the threat, the nature, objectives, and strategy. Second, it must maintain strong deterrence. We cannot go through what we did before by canceling exercises in the naive hope that Kim Jong Un will be mollified by canceling exercise. We must maintain the state of readiness. We must be, as is said in Korea by the Combined Forces Command, ready to fight tonight. At the same time, we need to be ready for collapse, but also the people need to be ready to unify today. So, ready to fight tonight, ready to unify today. Those are my two buzzwords buzz phrases that I'm trying to get to. So, maintain deterrence, maintain engagement. You can engage with North Korea as long as we do it from a superior political warfare strategy. The sanctions regime must be maintained because despite the evasion, it does have an impact on their development of weapons. And if we enforce sanctions, we could really conduct a strategic strangulation campaign to really cut off North Korea. But China and Russia help evade them. And none of the international community really has worked to enforce sanctions to the degree that it needs to be. And one of the ways to enforce sanctions, of course, is to go after the Chinese banks that facilitate money transfers to the north. But of course, that overlaps with a China strategy as well. Everything is interconnected. So deterrence, sanctions, engagement with a political warfare construct, and then what I really recommend that the new administration does is adopt a threefold strategy, which is based on a human rights upfront approach. And again, we have neglected human rights out of the naive belief that if we focus on human rights, that it would prevent a denuclearization agreement. When in fact we should look to Ronald Reagan. When he negotiated with the Soviet Union for arms control, he never wavered on human rights. Remember, he said, tear down this wall. And so we need to be able to do both, negotiate denuclearization, but never not talk about human rights. And of course, one of the ways to do that is an understanding of that when they conduct provocations, missile tests, or nuclear tests, we condemn them. When we do that, we're actually supporting North Korean propaganda that reinforces the legitimacy of the regime. So at the same time, we need to inform the Korean people and the international community that Kim Jong-un's deliberate decision to prioritize nuclear weapons and missile development over the welfare of the people is what is leading to their suffering and sacrifice. And of course, a focus on human rights undermines the legitimacy of the regime. Kim is threatened by that. In fact, today, one of the highest ranking living defectors from North Korea said that the human rights understanding is growing inside North Korea because of the international focus on it, and that it has an effect on Kim Jong-un. It somewhat moderates his behavior because he wants to maintain his legitimacy. So a human rights upfront approach. But we also need to inform the Korean people of the North what are their universal human rights. And one of the human rights that is often overlooked is in Article 21 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that is that people have a right to self-determination of government. And the Korean people in the North have never experienced that right. And so we really need to focus on that. And this really ties into an information program, a campaign to really inform the Korean people in the North and really focus on three target audiences. One is the elite to influence their behavior. The second is the second tier leadership, most of the military leaders outside of the core of the regime that have military power. And then, of course, the population. And you've got to prepare the population for unification. Now, I'm a strong advocate that we need to be using military psychological operations forces against the North Korean People's Army, military to military. Most people think that's an anachronism. They think that's old school. But when you think about it, it is the military that gives Kim Jong-un power. And there are two things, and I learned this from my good friend Greg Scarletou, who's the president and CEO of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, who lived through the Romanian Revolution. And his description of the revolution was that, they were in the streets, they were protesting. And the day that Ceausescu ordered the military to suppress the population, suppress the resistance, they put down their guns. And it was only because the military disobeyed the order that the Romanian Revolution was successful. And we need to think about that in North Korea. And actually, we need to think about that with every totalitarian regime. But a military PSYOP program focused on really causing the North Korean People's Army to do two things. One, disobey the attack to the south, and two, disobey the order to suppress the resistance inside North Korea. And if we use our military PSYOP to do that, then that also will spill over, of course, into other areas that other elements of our government may be working on: the Global Engagement Center, the CIA, covert influence, all of that. But we should be focusing on the military because that is one of the major center of gravity for power for the regime. And then lastly, it is unification that we must focus on. I mentioned Camp David. I mentioned the 815 unification doctrine. But here's what's most important about unification is we think about denuclearization first, then unification. I recommend we flip the conventional wisdom on its head and realize that there will be no denuclearization and no end to the crimes against humanity until there is unification. And so the focus should be on peaceful unification. And of course, unification done by the Korean people. And we should support the Korean people in their pursuit of unification. Now, South Korea should plan for peaceful unification. And this is really important. Peaceful unification planning, while it is unlikely to occur because Kim Jong-un will never give up the reins of power and allow himself to be reunited with the South, where he is not in control. However, planning for peaceful unification is the most comprehensive planning because it requires integration of two economic systems, two political systems, two militaries, and two divergent cultures that have been diverging for the last 7 decades. And so planning for all of that integration, while it may never happen peacefully, in the ideal way, all of that planning will be applied if there is war as the path to unification, if there is regime collapse that is the path to unification, or the outlier, if there's internal transformation inside North Korea that results in new emerging leadership that in fact could seek peaceful unification as the only way for the Korean people in the North to survive. And so that's really what I am recommending to this new administration. And I have developed a national security decision directive that is modeled after Ronald Reagan's national security decision directive 32 for a national security strategy, focused on support to a free and unified Korea and a holistic strategy towards North Korea. And so I've drafted that. I've drafted a political military campaign plan that national security directive decision directive tasks the NSC to develop. And so I've developed that. And so I have really thought this through and developed the strategy and campaign plans really to support South Korea, to support the people in North Korea as they seek a free and unified Korea.
Wow, that's fantastic. I'm sure we'll have some questions about that. I mean, I haven't seen that holistic approach being articulated. And like I said, the current strategies just seems to be focusing on the nuclear issue. So we do have some students here from the Future Strategist program at the University of South Florida. So if you have questions, please type them in. I have some questions already that they've submitted to me. So I'll ask you the first one. Let's get back to what we're talking about with the new administration. So in the last election for Trump, he's the first U.S. president, I think, who met with one of the Kims, right, with Kim Jong-un. So what do you think his reelection is going to have for U.S. foreign policy? Is it going to be more of the same, where he's, talking to a rocket man or missile man, whatever you call him? Or do you think it's going to be maybe the circumstances have changed and there'll be a new U.S. approach?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that there'll be a new U.S. approach. I think that both Kim Jong-un and President Trump both feel like they got burned by each other. in Hanoi in February of 2019. And so I don't think that Kim Jong Un has any appetite for coming back to the negotiating table, because I think that President Trump showed him that he can't be manipulated, which a lot of people will criticize him for. Uh, and also, I think President Trump is frustrated because he did offer him a grand bargain. He did offer him, in return for complete denuclearization and a pledge and a path to it. And so I think they both look at each other as they didn't get what they want. So I don't think there's going to be some kind of reenactment of the bromance that people call it, and the love letters. I think all of that rhetoric is campaign stuff. What I'm hopeful is that President Trump, his America First, is about protecting U.S. interests. And what it's incumbent upon us to do is to make sure he understands that, number one, U.S. interests in Northeast Asia is to prevent war, and number two, that the path to denuclearization is through unification and allowing Korea to do that. And I really want, President Trump doesn't want to get involved in forever wars. He doesn't want to get involved in entanglements. And the thing that's so different about Afghanistan and Iraq and the Middle East is that South Korea, can do this. South Korea must take the lead. And I believe that President Trump will support South Korea doing that, because it doesn't require the U.S. to be entangled. Yes, of course, we're going to provide military support. We're going to continue to deter, and yes, if necessary, if war does break out, that we will defend shoulder to shoulder with our blood ally. But it is in America's interest to prevent war, and if war happens, to end it as quickly as possible on the Korean Peninsula, favorable to the U.S. and the ROK-U.S. alliance. And so, if President Trump accepts that as a U.S. national interest, that will be very important, and that will also reassure the South Koreans as well, because they fear abandonment. They fear that we'll pull our troops out, or we'll only focus on China. But we may abandon allies, but we will never abandon our national interests. And so that's why we have to ensure that the president accepts defense of the Korean Peninsula and the outcome of the Korean Peninsula as a U.S. national interest, not as if we're there just out of the goodness of our hearts. We are there for the cold, calculated support of U.S. interests in Northeast Asia, because when you look at Northeast Asia, it is really one of the most important regions of the world. The largest military from China, Russia, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. The two largest economies, Japan and China. Two nuclear powers, China and Russia, and of course a rogue nuclear state of North Korea. And then the 10th largest economy in the world, South Korea. And so all of that, when you look at what happens there, what happens on the Korean Peninsula, whether it's war or regime collapse or peaceful unification, is going to have global effects. War and regime collapse will interrupt the global economy, but unification eventually will strengthen the global economy.
That's great. We'll see how much detail comes out in the next national security strategy, but that would be a vast change from the way I've seen it over my career. So another question here from a student, and you had mentioned North Korean serving in Russia. So can you dive a little bit further into that? Like, what's the trade-offs here? What does Russia gain out of this? What's China think about this? What is Kim Jong-un getting in return?
Okay, so first of all, we've heard reports 10 to 12,000, some speculation that eventually it could be up to 50,000. Clearly, Russia gets manpower. They have been, having a hard time recruiting, filling their military, high casualty rates. So manpower is number one that they get, in addition to all the munitions that have been shared. China, I believe, while they don't really like the relationship between North Korea and Russia to be growing, and the history is that North Korea has always played Russia and China off against each other. Kim Il-sung masterfully played Mao and Stalin in 1950. And there is a fear that Kim Jong-un will try to do the same. However, China does want Putin to be successful. He doesn't want Putin to fail. Xi Jinping doesn't want Putin to fail. But China also does not want to get its hands dirty by providing lethal aid. So North Korea actually provides China a cutout to helping support Putin. And so I think China gets that benefit. And what does North Korea get? Well, number one is money. Number two is likely advanced technology, something they really want, missile guidance for their ICBMs, and that high tech support there. And yes, they may get some food aid and things like that. But again, Kim Jong Un is not as worried about that as getting money, hard currency, and along with that, oil. They need fuel. This is a money making venture for the regime. So we're seeing that now. In what is Putin going to get from these 10,000 troops? They say much of them are special forces, special operations forces, which are really light infantry brigades. These guys are walking soldiers. The question is, how are they going to be employed? Are they going to be employed as special operations, trying to infiltrate Ukrainian lines, operate behind the lines? Okay, maybe so. If so, how will Russia exploit that? The Spetsnaz, the GRU, and the Wagner Group have not done very well in special operations. Do we think the North Koreans can do better? I don't think so. Are they going to be employed as combined arms? All they're sending are light infantry right now. So if it's combined arms, the Russians are going to have to provide tanks and artillery and the like. Are they trained to do that? Are they capable of doing that? And then lastly, we've seen reports where Russia is seeking North Korean translators, and one of the plans that we've read about has been there would be one translator, 3 Russian officers for every 30 North Koreans. That indicates to me that they're going to try to integrate the North Korean forces into the Russian army. To me, that's a recipe for failure. South Korea and the United States have a long history of working together. We have the Korean augmentee to the U.S. Army, Katusa program, with South Korean soldiers integrated in the U.S. Army. And we still have challenges with language and culture. It is unlikely. And of course, the intercepts we have seen and heard from Ukraine about Russians talking about these Koreans, they're just like Chinese, and really derogatory comments really indicate that there's unlikely to be any kind of combined allied cohesion that's necessary for successful operations.
Yeah, that's great. And you and I have both done partner operations. We know how tough that is, particularly when your force has all those biases within its own culture. Okay, here's another question by a student in the chat. He's asking about the possibility of China accepting a unified Korea, especially one that's free and democratic. How is China going to see that goal, and what would be their posture? I mean, the last time this happened, they threw in, I think, over 10 divisions across the border. So, how would you see that work? How would you see that foreign policy working between us and China on this unified Korea approach?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I love that question because I always turn that question around to ask, how would China prevent unification? Okay, what would be in China's interest to prevent unification? How far would they go to prevent unification? And what lengths would they go? Would that include possible meeting engagement with ROC and U.S. forces? Yes, in 1950, they came across with 1 million Chinese People's Volunteers. But at that time, they believed they were threatened, and MacArthur's rhetoric was pretty loud at the time. I believe China knows we have no intention of invading. We have no intention of invading North Korea, let alone invading China. And the fact is, since the 1990s, when we first wrote the plans for regime instability and regime collapse, which was then Conplan 5029, we actually shared those plans with China. on a number of occasions. The J5 went to China and briefed our plans for collapse because we wanted China to know that we have no designs on China. Of course, at the time, China said, "Thank you very much," no reciprocity. However, subsequent track twos that I have participated in, China says they'll intervene in North Korea really under two conditions. One is under UN mandate, and two is if they're invited in by some entity in North Korea. Now, what we need to understand, though, is North Korea and China do not like each other. They do not like each other. I mean, North Korea is responsible for Taiwan continuing to exist today. People forget that the first action we took in the Korean War was to send the Seventh Fleet into the Taiwan Straits because Mao was preparing to retake Taiwan and to destroy the nationalist forces in 1950. The Civil War ended in 1949 with Chiang Kai-shek going to Taiwan. And we were afraid that the invasion of the peninsula would allow Mao to do that. So we sent the Seventh Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. That prevented Mao from unifying China. And so there is no love between North Korea and China. Of course, Mao lost his son in North Korea, and so there's a lot of history there. That said, for them to go into North Korea, they would have a harder time probably than we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Korean people in the North are the most indoctrinated, most xenophobic, and they will oppose. And this is something we need to think about. They will oppose China just as much as they'll oppose South Korea and the United States. Any forces going into North Korea are going to be faced with resistance unless we can effectively use information to prepare for the future. But China will be faced with the same complexities, and they do not want to absorb North Korea and have to shoulder that burden for 25 million people, the cost. They would rather have South Korea shoulder that burden because they're the ones who have to absorb the costs, and they can reap the benefits by weakening South Korea, a unified Korea, and having economic and political domination of the region. So a buffer zone is nice. And that's why I say, paradoxically, they want to continue to maintain the status quo for as long as possible. But when it no longer can be maintained, I believe they will support unification rather than prevent it. Because their long-term goal is to get U.S. forces off the peninsula. And if U.S. forces are off the peninsula, then a unified Korea is not as threatening as a Korea with U.S. forces there.
Okay, great. Here's another question. Will Chinese trade North Korea for Taiwan? That is an excellent question. Someone who's really understanding the regional dynamics.
So let me say that in the track two that I participated in, the track twos, South Koreans would always say that they don't want a contingency in North Korea to be an excuse for China to intervene. And they would turn to us and say, please keep China out of North Korea. Well, we would then have a bilateral session with the Chinese, and they would say the same thing. We don't want a contingency in North Korea to be an excuse for South Korea to unify the peninsula. But then they would say, however, we empathize with our Korean brothers because we want unification too. And I mean, they were transmitting the message, quid pro quo. You can have Korea, we want Taiwan. So that's really a fascinating way to look at it. Now, I don't think there will ever be any kind of international agreement. We can reunify Korea and you can have Taiwan. I don't think that we're ever gonna stand for that. But I think that is one way that China looks at it. I mean, their main priority is unification with Taiwan. It is not preventing unification of Korea. But the question is so important is because we cannot look at Korea and Taiwan separately, particularly if there are contingencies, if there is a conflict, because there's really three things that could happen: simultaneous war, North and South, worse, in Korea and Taiwan simultaneously, or Taiwan happening first, then Korea, or Korea happening first, then Taiwan. in every situation, that's a huge lift for us and our allies to deal with multiple contingencies. And so, we cannot disconnect and treat Taiwan in a vacuum and treat Korea in a vacuum. The question alone that you asked recognizes that we must consider the contingencies together. Now, will Kim Jong Un use nuclear weapons, resort to nuclear weapons? I believe that their nuclear weapons are baked into their campaign plan. For them, we have a great taboo on nuclear weapons. It's a terrible thing. But for, I think, North Korea and many of our communist and former communist or totalitarian regimes, it's just a big weapon, and I don't think they fear to use it as much as we fear to use it. And so I think that if North Korea makes the decision to go to war, that they're going to use nuclear weapons, and their plans to attack South Korea really have to be a lot like they were in 1950 because the geography hasn't changed except that it's more urbanized. But for North Korea to be successful in dominating the South, they have to get to Pusan before South Korea can mobilize its reserves and before the U.S. can reinforce. Therefore, the ports in South Korea and in Japan, the 7 UN designated bases in Japan, are all critical to mobilizing and reinforcing the peninsula. And so I think that is likely that Kim Jong Un would use nuclear weapons on those facilities or chemical weapons and or in order to prevent their use by the Allies to support the defense. So I think you have to plan for weapons of mass destruction if they go to war. But ultimately, we've got to deter war, and that's really the priority that we have to focus on. And of course, the only way to deter war is demonstrated strength and readiness of our and willingness to defend South Korea.
Well, Dave, we're coming up at an hour here. So can you give any tips to students, that want to stay engaged into this topic? How can they get, information about what's happening with U.S. foreign policy and what's happening on the peninsula?
Well, number one is you can go to Small Wars Journal, and every day I post national security and Korea news and commentary. And so I post between a dozen and 20 articles with my commentary on Small Wars Journal. So you can access there every day, 7 days a week to do that. That's one resource. The second thing for all of you strategists, something I've been focusing on recently is reviewing the Reagan archives and all of the national security decision directives. And I have found those to be really well done and some better than the strategies I have seen written through the 90s and 2000s. Like I said, NSDD 32, Reagan's national security strategy, was classified top secret and only 36 copies were produced. And it's now declassified. And it really is a good model for how we should be thinking about strategy. So I would have all of you aspiring strategists, go to the Reagan Library, to the archives, the digitized national security decision directives. There's only a few that are not published because they remain classified. Some have redactions in it. But I think, and you can look at regional strategies for East Asia, for specific countries, and all kinds of valuable work that has been done of a really high intellectual quality, which I think has relevance for today, properly updated and with the current conditions, political and otherwise. And I'm using those, and I recommend a study of those by all of you aspiring strategists.
Awesome. Hey, Colonel Maxwell, I know you're really busy. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and experience on this important topic. And thank you for everything that you're doing on the unification of Korea.
Thank you. Great to talk with you, and I'm happy to engage with anybody in a follow-up. And so I appreciate all the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.